She can't have all of it. 40 years of that farm and he leaves it, all of it, to her? That's not a will, that's a punishment.
I called him foolish. I sat in his kitchen and called him foolish.
You don't know what he did. You never stayed long enough to find out.
The coffin was already in the ground when the shouting started. It wasn't grief that broke the silence of Millhaven's oldest cemetery, that cold October morning. It was rage. Pure, ugly, entitled rage, cutting through the fog like a blade. She can't have it all. Marcus Calloway's voice cracked across the headstones, his expensive suit already wrinkled from the overnight flight he'd taken from Chicago. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. His brother Derek stood 3 feet away, jaw tight, hands jammed into the pockets of a coat that cost more than their father had made in 3 good months of farming. I'm calling a lawyer. Tonight. Between them, their sister Clara stood completely still, her muddy boots sinking slightly into the earth beside the fresh grave, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't cry. She didn't shout back. She simply looked at the headstone. Earl James Calloway, 1951 to 2024. He was faithful and breathed. The lawyer, Mr. Pruitt, cleared his throat from beneath his umbrella. Gentlemen, the will is quite clear. The will, Marcus snapped, spinning toward him, was written by a man who clearly lost his mind somewhere between the wheat fields and the grave. Clara finally turned to look at her brothers, and something in her eyes, not anger, not triumph, made them both go quiet for just a moment. It was pity, the deep, exhausted kind. You don't know what he did, she said softly. You never stayed long enough to find out. If you've ever loved someone the world never understood, stay right here. Subscribe, because this is the kind of story that changes how you see everything. Earl Calloway had hands like old oak roots. That was the first thing people noticed about him, the way his fingers curled slightly even at rest, permanently shaped by 30 years of gripping plow handles, fence posts, and the steering wheel of a truck that had no business still running. He was not a tall man, not a loud man. But when Earl walked into a room, something shifted. People couldn't always explain it. They just felt it. He had met Margaret Ann Briggs at a county fair in the summer of 1978. She was laughing at something her friend had said, head thrown back, completely unguarded, and Earl had stopped walking in the middle of a crowd and just stared. His buddy Ray elbowed him. "Close your mouth, Earl. You look like a fish." He proposed 8 months later in the cab of that same impossible truck, the heater broken, both of them wrapped in the same wool blanket. Margaret said yes before he finished the sentence. Marcus came first, then Derek 2 years later, and Clara arrived on the last day of a brutal February, a full month early. So small, the doctor looked genuinely worried. Earl held her in both hands, those great oak root hands, and whispered something to her that no one else heard. Margaret always swore, for the rest of her life, that Clara heard every word of it. The farm wasn't much. 43 acres of decent soil in the river valley outside Millhaven, Tennessee. Earl grew corn, some wheat, kept a modest herd. It was enough, barely in the good years. In the bad years, Margaret stretched every dollar so thin you could see light through it, and Earl worked from before the sun came up to long after it went down, and neither of them ever once complained to the children. That was a choice they made deliberately. They did not want their children to carry weight that wasn't theirs. But children feel things, even when you don't tell them. Marcus was 14 the first time he felt the particular burn of embarrassment that can only come from a father who doesn't fit the world you're starting to want. It happened at a football game. His friend Ricky's father showed up in a silver Mercedes, tie loosened, laughing loud, smelling like something expensive. He handed Ricky two $50 bills in front of everyone like it was nothing, like money was air. Marcus looked across the bleachers and found Earl in his cleanest flannel shirt, which still had a faint grease stain on the cuff, eating a hot dog and cheering too loudly for a team that wasn't even his son's. Something curdled in Marcus's chest that night. He didn't have a name for it then. Later, he'd understand it was shame. And later still, much later, he'd understand that shame was the thing that cost him most in life. Derek absorbed his older brother's opinions like a sponge. Where Marcus was loud about his embarrassment, Derek was cold. He began answering his father's questions in shorter and shorter sentences. He stopped inviting friends over. When Earl came to his high school graduation, Derek steered him toward the back row and spent the whole ceremony glancing over his shoulder. Earl noticed. He always noticed. But he smiled and sat where he was told. Clara was 12 during Derek's graduation. She sat beside her father in that back row, and she reached over and put her small hand on top of his weathered one without a word. Earl looked down at her hand, then up at the stage, and his smile that day had something bittersweet tucked inside it, like a letter folded too many times. The arguments grew worse when the boys were in their 20s, and the farm hit 3 bad years in a row. A drought, then flooding, then a blight that wiped out 2/3 of the corn. Earl borrowed against the land, quietly, and told Margaret before he told anyone else. Marcus drove down from Nashville one weekend. He was in finance by then, doing well, wearing it like armor, and spread some papers across the kitchen table, like a man who had come to save his foolish father from himself. "There's a guy I know," Marcus said, "Carl Whitmore. He flips agricultural subsidies. It's gray area, not technically illegal, and farmers do it all the time. You could clear $40,000 in one season." Earl poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of Marcus, sat down. "I appreciate you thinking of me, son." "Dad, $40,000. "I heard you. Then why are you looking at me like that?" Earl wrapped both hands around his mug. "Because what you're describing is fraud. The gray area you're talking about, that's just the color dishonesty turns when successful people practice it long enough." Marcus laughed, but it wasn't warm. "You're going to lecture me about ethics while you're losing the farm?" "I'm not losing the farm." Earl said it quietly, but with the kind of certainty that doesn't invite argument. "I'm having a hard year. There's a difference. A hard year." Marcus stood up. "Dad, you've had nothing but hard years. Don't you ever wonder why? Don't you ever get tired?" Earl looked at his son for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not hurt exactly, but something deeper and older. "Every single day," he said. "But tired and wrong aren't the same direction." Marcus left that afternoon without finishing his coffee. 2 years later, Derek came with his own proposal. A land developer from Nashville wanted the river acreage, would pay 3 times what it was worth, cash, fast close, no questions. Derek had already spoken to the man, already shaken his hand in principle. He brought it up at dinner, which was a mistake. Margaret set down her fork. That alone was enough to change the temperature of the room. "Your father's grandfather broke that soil," she said. Not loud, not emotional. Simply stated, the way you state something that is not open for interpretation. "Mama, with respect, sentiment doesn't pay the water bill." "Derek," Earl's voice quiet, I'm serious, Dad. The farm is bleeding. You could walk away with enough to retire. You could rest. Don't you want to rest? Earl picked up his fork again. I'll rest when I'm done. Done with what? You're 73 years old. Done with what I started. He met Derek's eyes. I understand you want to help. I do. But this farm isn't a problem to be solved. It's a life being lived. Those are different things. Derek drove back to Memphis that night with his jaw set, and he didn't come back for 8 months. Clara helped Earl finish the dishes. They didn't talk much. They never needed to. Does it hurt? She asked finally, handing him the last plate. When they push like that. Earl dried the plate in his slow, thorough way. It hurts that they're unhappy, he said. Not that they push. He set the plate on the shelf. You can't be angry at a person for not seeing something they were never taught to look for. Clara leaned against the counter and studied him. What were they supposed to look for? He smiled, that particular smile of his, the one that always seemed to know more than it was telling. You already know, he said. That's why I'm not worried about you. Margaret died on a Thursday in April, quietly in the bedroom where she and Earl had slept for 41 years. A stroke. Sudden. No suffering. Earl sat beside her bed for 3 hours after, holding her hand, talking to her in a voice too low for Clara, sitting just outside the door to make out. She didn't try to listen closer. Some conversations aren't meant for witnesses. The funeral brought the boys back. It also brought something else. The first cracks in the wall they'd spent years building between themselves and this place. Marcus cried at the graveside, ugly and unguarded, and looked briefly like the 14-year-old boy who used to race through the cornrows with bare feet. Derek stood very straight and very still, which was its own kind of grief. After the burial, the three of them sat on the porch, first time in years, without the buffer of a crowd or a meal or a purpose. Just the three of them and the sound of the farm at dusk. She loved this place, Clara said. Neither brother argued. She loved him, Derek said finally. And the way he said it, careful, almost confused, suggested he was only now understanding that love and logic don't require each other. Earl was inside. They could see his shadow moving through the kitchen window, making coffee, probably making too much of it out of 41 years of habit. And none of them mentioned it. Earl lasted 3 more years after Margaret. He slowed, but not in the way people expected. He didn't become sad or small. He became deliberate, every task completed, as though it had been thought about and chosen. He and Clara ran the farm together. She had never left, had built a quiet life there, a real one. And in those 3 years, they added a small vegetable co-op partnership with 2 neighboring families, turned the Eastfield into something genuinely profitable for the first time in a decade. The boys visited more. Not enough, but more. On the last night of his life, Earl asked Clara to bring him the wooden box from the top shelf of the closet. She didn't ask why. She brought it, set it on the bed beside him, and he put his hand on the lid for a moment. There are things in here, he said, that people should probably know. Okay, Daddy. Not tonight. Okay. He looked at her, this daughter with his mother's patience and her own particular brand of steel, and he said, You were the best thing I ever did that wasn't an accident. She laughed despite herself. That's a strange compliment. I mean it strangely. He reached over and squeezed her hand. You chose this. Every day, when you could have left, you chose it. That means everything I built here. It lives in someone who understood it. He was gone by morning, peacefully, the way men sometimes go when they have genuinely finished what they came to do. The box sat unopened through the first 4 days. Mr. Pruitt read the will first. The farm, the equipment, all 43 acres, to Clara May Calloway, entirely and without condition. And that was when Marcus started shouting in the cemetery. It was Clara who opened the box that evening, alone at the kitchen table, her brother's cars visible through the window, still parked in the drive because Mr. Pruitt had asked them all to reconvene the next morning. Inside the box, a folded newspaper from September 1994, a manila envelope sealed with tape that had gone yellow and brittle, 3 handwritten pages in Earl's slow, careful script, and a photograph of a young man Clara had never seen. She started with the newspaper. The headline read, "Local farmer blamed in silo collapse. 1 dead, investigation ongoing." The farmer named was Earl James Calloway. Clara's hand stopped moving. She set the newspaper down, picked up the handwritten pages. Her father's voice came through the words so clearly she had to remind herself he wasn't in the room. The boy who opened the wrong valve was 22 years old. His name was Thomas Greer. He had a wife who was 7 months pregnant and a father who was already sick. If the investigation had landed on him, and it would have, the evidence was clear, he would have faced criminal charges. His family would have been destroyed. I knew this because I knew Thomas. I knew the kind of man he was trying to become. I also knew that my reputation in this county would survive what his could not. I had land. I had Margaret. I had roots. He had nothing yet except a life just starting. I went to the investigator and I told them the accident had happened on my watch, under my instruction. It was not true. But it ended Thomas's liability, and it began mine. I am not telling you this so you will think well of me. I am telling you because I want you to understand why I never argued when people thought less of me for it. The less they thought of me, the more protected Thomas remained. His daughter is 29 now. She doesn't know. She may never need to. There was never a version of this where I was also celebrated for it. I accepted that before I made the choice. I would accept it again. Clara sat at that table for a long time without moving. Then she opened the manila envelope. Inside was a letter, dated 2019, 5 years ago, from a man named Thomas Greer. Earl, I have carried this for 25 years, and I cannot carry it anymore. My daughter asked me recently what kind of man I was at her age. I didn't know how to answer. I know what kind of man you were. I know what you gave up. I am not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I see it, that I have always seen it, that there has not been a day. The letter ended there. Clara folded it carefully, set it down, and then, only then, she let herself cry. Not for long, just long enough for the grief to move through her completely. She called her brothers in at 9 o'clock that night, set the box and all its contents on the table, watched their faces as they read. Marcus read the newspaper first. His expression moved through confusion, then disbelief, then something she'd never seen on her older brother's face, shame so deep it looked like physical pain. Derek read the handwritten pages twice. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He never told us. No. All those years when we thought... Derek stopped, tried again. When we told him he couldn't finish. He knew what you thought, Clara said, not unkindly. He chose not to defend himself because defending himself meant explaining, and explaining meant risking Thomas. Marcus pressed both hands flat on the table. We stood in his kitchen and called him foolish. We told him he didn't understand how the world worked. Yes. And he just smiled. Yes. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges things. Not comfortable, not resolved, but real. The kind of silence that does actual work. Finally, Marcus looked at his sister, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. How are you not angry at us? Clara considered the question seriously. Because he wasn't, she said, and he was the one who had the right to be. 3 weeks after the funeral, a story ran in the Millhaven Courier. Clara had given them the documents, with Thomas Greer's blessing, after a phone call that lasted 2 hours and ended with both of them unable to speak. The headline read, "The Truth About the 1994 Silo Collapse." A man finally cleared after 30 years. People in town who had quietly doubted Earl Calloway for 3 decades began leaving things on the porch of the farm. Pies, notes, a jar of honey with no name attached. Old Mr. Hensley from the hardware store came himself, hat in hand, and told Clara he'd spent 30 years being wrong about her father, and he was sorry he hadn't said so sooner. He wouldn't want your apology, Clara told him. He'd want you to have coffee. And she brought him inside. Marcus flew back to Millhaven for the 2nd time in a month. Without being asked, he sat with Clara on the porch, and they talked until dark, the first real conversation they'd had in perhaps 20 years. He was different now, not fixed, not redeemed in any clean, satisfying way, but cracked open, which is where light gets in. Derek came too, the following weekend. He brought his wife, who had never met Clara, and his 2 kids, who had never seen the farm. The oldest boy, 9 years old, with his grandfather's curious eyes, ran into the cornfield within 10 minutes and had to be retrieved, muddy and delighted. And Clara laughed so hard she doubled over. She didn't sell the farm. She never considered it. The co-op partnership expanded. She brought in 2 young farmers from the county agriculture program, gave them shares, taught them what Earl had taught her. Within 5 years, the farm was more productive and more intentional than it had ever been, not wealthy by Marcus's standards, but alive in a way that no amount of money had ever managed to manufacture. On the 1st anniversary of Earl's death, the 3 Calloway siblings stood together at his grave. No shouting this time. No lawyers. No agendas. Just 3 people standing in the place where all things reduce to what they actually are. Marcus put a hand on the headstone. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The inscription was simple. Clara had chosen it herself, from something Earl had said to her once on a cold morning when the fields were frozen and the work was hard, and she had asked him if it was worth it. He had looked at her, those quiet eyes, that half smile, those oak root hands, and said, "The right thing doesn't need an audience. It only needs to be done." That was Earl Calloway. That was the whole of him. Not famous, not celebrated, not wealthy. Just a man who, when the moment came and the cost was real, made the harder choice without a single witness. He never told a soul. He never asked for credit. He simply went back to his fields. And 30 years later, the truth grew up out of that same soil, slow and deep-rooted, the way all things do when they are tended with love and time. Some legacies don't announce themselves. They just outlast everything else.